Listen and relax. Crafting serenity, one audiobook at a time.
Narrative of Meredith Blake. Dear Monsieur Poirot, as I promised you, I have set down in writing an account of all I can remember relating to the tragic events that happened 16 years ago. First of all, I would like to say that I have thought over carefully all you said to me at our recent meeting, and on reflection, I am more convinced than I was before that it is in the highest degree unlikely that Caroline Crail poisoned her husband. It always seemed incongruous, but the absence of any other explanation and her own attitude led me to follow, sheep-like, the opinion of other people, and to say with them that if she didn't do it, what explanation could there be? Since seeing you, I have reflected very carefully on the alternative solution presented at the time and brought forward by the defense at the trial. That is, that Amias Crail took his own life. Although, from what I knew of him, that solution seemed quite fantastic at the time. I now see fit to modify my opinion. To begin with, and highly significant, is the fact that Caroline believed it. If we are now to take it that that charming and gentle lady was unjustly convicted, then her own frequently reiterated belief must carry great weight. She knew Amias better than anyone else. If she thought suicide possible, then suicide must have been possible in spite of the skepticism of his friends. I will advance the theory, therefore, that there was in Amias Crail some core of conscience, some undercurrent of remorse and even despair at the excesses to which his temperament led him, of which only his wife was aware. This, I think, is a not impossible supposition. He may have shown that side of himself only to her. Though it is inconsistent with anything I ever heard him say, yet it is nevertheless a truth that in most men there is some unsuspected and inconsistent streak which often comes as a surprise to people who have known them intimately. A respected and austere man is discovered to have had a coarser side to his life hidden. A vulgar money-maker has perhaps a secret appreciation of some delicate work of art. Hard and ruthless people have been convicted of unsuspected hidden kindnesses. Generous and jovial men have been shown to have a mean and cruel side to them. So it may be that in Amias Crail there ran a strain of morbid self-accusation, and that the more he blustered out his egoism and his right to do as he pleased, the more strongly that secret conscience of his worked. It is improbable on the face of it, but I now believe that it must have been so. And I repeat again, Caroline herself held steadfastly to that view. That, I repeat, is significant. And now to examine facts, or rather, my memory of facts, in the light of that new belief. I think that I might with relevance include here a conversation I held with Caroline some weeks before the actual tragedy. It was during Elsa Greer's first visit to Alderbury. Caroline, as I have told you, was aware of my deep affection and friendship for her. I was therefore the person in whom she could most easily confide. She had not been looking very happy. Nevertheless, I was surprised when she suddenly asked me one day whether I thought Amias really cared very much for this girl he had brought down. I said, "He's interested in painting her. You know what Amias is." She shook her head and said, "No, he's in love with her." "Well, perhaps a little. A great deal, I think." I said, "She is unusually attractive, I admit, and we both know that Amias is susceptible. But you must know by now, my dear, that Amias really only cares for one person, and that is you. He has these infatuations, but they don't last. You are the one person to him, and though he behaves badly, it does not really affect his feeling for you." Caroline said, "That is what I always used to think. Believe me, Caro," I said, "it is so." She said, "But this time, Mary, I'm afraid. That girl is so terribly sincere. She's so young, so intense. I've a feeling that this time it's serious." I said, "But the very fact that she is so young and, as you say, so sincere will protect her. On the whole, women are fair game to Amias, but in the case of a girl like this, it will be different." She said, "Yes, that's what I'm afraid of. It will be different. And she went on, "I'm 34, you know, Mary, and we've been married 10 years. In looks, I can't hold a candle to this Elsa child, and I know it." I said, "But you know, Caroline, you know that Amias is really devoted to you." She said to that, "Does one ever know with men?" And then she laughed a little ruefully and said, "I'm a very primitive woman, Mary. I'd like to take a hatchet to that girl." I told her that the child probably didn't understand in the least what she was doing. She had a great admiration and hero worship for Amias, and she probably didn't realize at all that Amias was falling in love with her. Caroline just said to me, "Dear Mary," and began to talk about the garden. I hoped that she was not going to worry any more about the matter. Shortly afterwards, Elsa went back to London. Amias was away, too, for several weeks. I had really forgotten all about the business, and then I heard that Elsa was back again at Alderbury in order that Amias might finish the picture. I was a little disturbed by the news, but Caroline, when I saw her, was not in a communicative mood. She seemed quite her usual self, not worried or upset in any way. I imagined that everything was all right. That's why it was such a shock to me to learn how far the thing had gone. I have told you of my conversations with Crail and with Elsa. I had no opportunity of talking to Caroline. We were only able to exchange those few words about which I have already told you. I can see her face now, the wide, dark eyes and the restrained emotion. I can still hear her voice as she said, "Everything's finished." I can't describe to you the infinite desolation she conveyed in those words. They were a literal statement of truth. With Amias's defection, everything was finished for her. That, I am convinced, was why she took the Conaine. It was a way out, a way suggested to her by my stupid dissertation on the drug, and the passage I read from the Phaedo gives a gracious picture of death. Here is my present belief. She took the Conaine, resolved to end her own life when Amias left her. He may have seen her take it, or he may have discovered that she had it later. That discovery acted upon him with terrific force. He was horrified at what his actions had led her to contemplate. But notwithstanding his horror and remorse, he still felt himself incapable of giving up Elsa. I can understand that. Anyone who had fallen in love with her would find it almost impossible to tear himself away. He could not envisage life without Elsa. He realized that Caroline could not live without him. He decided there was only one way out, to use the Conaine himself. And the manner in which he did it might be characteristic of the man, I think. His painting was the dearest thing in life to him. He chose to die literally with his brush in his hand, and the last thing his eyes would see was the face of the girl he loved so desperately. He might have thought, too, that his death would be the best thing for her. I admit that this theory leaves certain curious facts unexplained. Why, for instance, were only Caroline's fingerprints found on the empty Conaine bottle? I suggest that after Amias had handled it, all prints got smudged or rubbed off by the soft piles of stuffs that were lying over the bottle, and that after his death Caroline handled it to see if anyone had touched it. Surely that is possible and plausible. As to the evidence about the fingerprints on the beer bottle, the witnesses for the defense were of opinion that a man's hand might be distorted after taking poison, and so could manage to grasp a beer bottle in a wholly unnatural way. One other thing remains to be explained: Caroline's own attitude throughout the trial. But I think I have now seen the cause for that. It was she who actually took the poison from my laboratory. It was her determination to do away with herself that impelled her husband to take his own life instead. Surely it is not unreasonable to suppose that in a morbid excess of responsibility she considered herself responsible for his death, that she persuaded herself that she was guilty of murder, though not the kind of murder of which she was being accused. I think all that could be so. And if that is the case, then surely it would be easy for you to persuade little Carla of the fact. And she can marry her young man and rest contented that the only thing of which her mother was guilty was an impulse, no more, to take her own life. All this, alas, is not what you asked me for. which was an account of the happenings as I remember them. Let me now repair that omission. I have already told you fully what happened on the day preceding Amias's death. We now come to the day itself. I had slept very badly, worried by the disastrous turn of events for my friends. After a long, wakeful period, whilst I vainly tried to think of something helpful I could do to avert the catastrophe, I fell into a heavy sleep about 6 a.m. The bringing of my early tea did not awaken me, and I finally woke up heavy-headed and unrefreshed about 9:30. It was shortly after that I thought I heard movements in the room below me, which was the room I used as a laboratory. I may say here that actually the sounds were probably caused by a cat getting in. I found the window sash raised a little way, as it had carelessly been left from the day before. It was just wide enough to admit the passage of a cat. I merely mentioned the sounds to explain how I came to enter the laboratory. I went in there as soon as I had dressed, and looking along the shelves I noticed that the bottle containing the preparation of conaine was slightly out of line with the rest. Having had my eye drawn to it in this way, I was startled to see that a considerable quantity of it had gone. The bottle had been nearly full the day before. Now it was nearly empty. I shut and locked the window and went out, locking the door behind me. I was considerably upset and also bewildered. When startled, my mental processes are, I am afraid, somewhat slow. I was first disturbed, then apprehensive, and finally definitely alarmed. I questioned the household, and they all denied having entered the laboratory at all. I thought things over a little while longer, and then decided to ring my brother and get his advice. Philip was quicker than I was. He saw the seriousness of my discovery and urged me to come over at once and consult with him. I went out, encountering Miss Williams, who had come across from the other side to look for a truant pupil. I assured her that I had not seen Angela, and that she had not been to the house. I think that Miss Williams noticed there was something amiss. She looked at me rather curiously. I had no intention, however, of telling her what had happened. I suggested she should try the kitchen garden. Angela had a favourite apple tree there, and I myself hurried down to the shore and rowed myself across to the Alderbury side. My brother was already there waiting for me. We walked up to the house together by the way you and I went the other day. Having seen the topography, you can understand that in passing underneath the wall of the Battery garden, we were bound to overhear anything being said inside it. Beyond the fact that Caroline and Amias were engaged in a disagreement of some kind, I did not pay much attention to what was said. Certainly, I overheard no threat of any kind uttered by Caroline. The subject of discussion was Angela, and I presume Caroline was pleading for a respite from the fiat of school. Amias, however, was adamant, shouting out irritably that it was all settled. He'd see to her packing. The door of the Battery opened just as we drew abreast of it, and Caroline came out. She looked disturbed, but not unduly so. She smiled rather absently at me, and said they had been discussing Angela. Elsa came down the path at that minute, and as Amias clearly wanted to get on with the sitting without interruption from us, we went on up the path. Philip blamed himself severely afterwards for the fact that we did not take immediate action, but I myself cannot see it the same way. We had no earthly right to assume that such a thing as murder was being contemplated. Moreover, I now believe that it was not contemplated. It was clear that we should have to adopt some course of action, but I still maintain that we were right to talk the matter over carefully first. It was necessary to find the right thing to do, and once or twice I found myself wondering if I had not after all made a mistake. Had the bottle really been full the day before, as I thought? I am not one of those people, like my brother Philip, who can be cocksure of everything. One's memory does play tricks on one. How often, for instance, one is convinced one has put an article in a certain place, later to find that you have put it somewhere quite different. The more I tried to recall the state of the bottle on the preceding afternoon, the more uncertain and doubtful I became. This was very annoying to Philip, who began completely to lose patience with me. We were not able to continue our discussion at the time, and tacitly agreed to postpone it until after lunch. I may say that I was always free to drop in for lunch at Alderbury if I chose. Later, Angela and Caroline brought us beer. I asked Angela what she had been up to playing truant, and told her Miss Williams was on the warpath, and she said she had been bathing, and added that she didn't see why she should have to mend her horrible old skirt when she was going to have all new things to go to school with. Since there seemed no chance of further talk with Philip alone, and since I was really anxious to think things out by myself, I wandered off down the path towards the battery. Just above the battery, as I showed you, there is a clearing in the trees, and there used to be an old bench. I sat there smoking and thinking, and watching Elsa as she sat posing for Amias. I shall always think of her as she was that day, rigid in the pose, with her yellow shirt and dark blue trousers, and a red pullover slung round her shoulders for warmth. Her face was so alight with life and health and radiance, and that gay voice of hers reciting plans for the future. This sounds as though I was eavesdropping, but that is not so. I was perfectly visible to Elsa. Both she and Amias knew I was there. She waved her hand at me and called up that Amias was a perfect bear that morning. He wouldn't let her rest. She was stiff and aching all over. Amias growled out that she wasn't as stiff as he was. He was stiff all over. Muscular rheumatism. Elsa said mockingly, "Poor old man." And he said she'd be taking on a creaking invalid. It shocked me, you know, their light-hearted acquiescence in their future together, whilst they were causing so much suffering. And yet I couldn't hold it against her. She was so young, so confident, so very much in love, and she didn't really know what she was doing. She didn't understand suffering. She just assumed with the naive confidence of a child that Caroline would be all right, that she'd soon get over it. She saw nothing, you see, but herself and Amias, happy together. She'd already told me my point of view was old-fashioned. She had no doubts, no qualms, no pity either. But can one expect pity from radiant youth? It is an older, wiser emotion. They didn't talk very much, of course. No painter wants to be chattering when he is working. Perhaps every 10 minutes or so, Elsa would make an observation, and Amias would grunt a reply. Once she said, "I think you're right about Spain. That's the first place we'll go to. And you must take me to see a bullfight. It must be wonderful, only I'd like the bull to kill the man, not the other way about. I understand how Roman women felt when they saw a man die. Men aren't much, but animals are splendid." I suppose she was rather like an animal herself, young and primitive, and with nothing yet of man's sad experience and doubtful wisdom. I don't believe Elsa had begun to think. She only felt. But she was very much alive, more alive than any person I've ever known. That was the last time I saw her radiant and assured, on top of the world. Fey is the word for it, isn't it? The bell sounded for lunch, and I got up and went down the path and in at the battery door, and Elsa joined me. It was dazzlingly bright there, coming in out of the shady trees. I could hardly see. Amias was sprawled back on the seat, his arms flung out. He was staring at the picture. I've so often seen him like that. How was I to know that already the poison was working, stiffening him as he sat? He so hated and resented illness. He would never own to it. I dare say he thought he'd got a touch of the sun. The symptoms are much the same, but he'd be the last person to complain about it. Elsa said, "He won't come up to lunch." Privately, I thought he was wise. I said, "So long, then." He moved his eyes from the picture until they rested on me. There was a queer... how shall I describe it? It looked like malevolence, a kind of malevolent glare. Naturally, I didn't understand it then. If his picture wasn't going as he liked, he often looked quite murderous. I thought that was what it was. He made a sort of grunting sound. Neither Elsa nor I saw anything unusual in him, just artistic temperament. So we left him there, and she and I went up to the house, laughing and talking. If she'd known, poor child, that she'd never see him alive again. Oh, well, thank God she didn't. She was able to be happy a little longer. Caroline was quite normal at lunch, a little preoccupied, nothing more. And doesn't that show that she had nothing to do with it? She couldn't have been such an actress. She and the governess went down afterwards and found him. I met Miss Williams as she came up. She told me to telephone a doctor and went back to Caroline. That poor child. Elsa, I mean. She had that frantic, unrestrained grief that a child has. They can't believe that life can do these things to them. Caroline was quite calm. Yes, she was quite calm. She was able, of course, to control herself better than Elsa. She didn't seem remorseful. Then. Just said he must have done it himself. And we couldn't believe that. Elsa burst out and accused her to her face. Of course, she may have realized already that she herself would be suspected. Yes, that probably explains her manner. Philip was quite convinced that she had done it. The governess was a great help and standby. She made Elsa lie down and gave her a sedative, and she kept Angela out of the way when the police came. Yes, she was a tower of strength, that woman. The whole thing became a nightmare. The police searching the house and asking questions, and then the reporters swarming about the place like flies and clicking cameras and wanting interviews with members of the family. A nightmare, the whole thing. It's a nightmare after all these years. Please God, once you've convinced little Carla what really happened, we can forget it all and never remember it again. Amias must have committed suicide, however unlikely it seems. End of Meredith Blake's narrative. Narrative of Lady Dittersham. I have set down here the full story of my meeting with Amias Crail, up until the time of his tragic death. I saw him first at a studio party. He was standing, I remember, by a window, and I saw him as I came in at the door. I asked who he was. Someone said, "That's Crail, the painter." I said at once that I'd like to meet him. We talked on that occasion for perhaps 10 minutes. When anyone makes the impression on you that Amias Crail made on me, it's hopeless to attempt to describe them. If I say that when I saw Amias Crail, everybody else seemed to grow very small and fade away, that expresses it as well as anything can. Immediately after that meeting, I went to look at as many of his pictures as I could. He had a show on in Bond Street at the moment, and there was one of his pictures in Manchester, and one in Leeds, and 2 in public galleries in London. I went to see them all. Then I met him again. I said, "I've been to see all your pictures. I think they're wonderful." He just looked amused. He said, "Who said you were any judge of painting? I don't believe you know anything about it." I said, "Perhaps not, but they are marvellous all the same." He grinned at me and said, "Don't be a gushing little fool." I said, "I'm not. I want you to paint me." Crail said, "If you've got any sense at all, you'll realize that I don't paint portraits of pretty women." I said, "It needn't be a portrait, and I'm not a pretty woman." He looked at me then as though he'd begun to see me. He said, "No, perhaps you're not." I said, "Will you paint me then?" He studied me for some time with his head on one side. Then he said, "You're a strange child, aren't you?" I said, "I'm quite rich, you know. I can afford to pay well for it." He said, "Why are you so anxious for me to paint you?" I said, "Because I want it." He said, "Is that a reason?" And I said, "Yes, I always get what I want." He said then, "Oh, my poor child, how young you are." I said, "Will you paint me?" He took me by the shoulders and turned me towards the light and looked me over. Then he stood away from me a little. I stood quite still, waiting. He said, "I've sometimes wanted to paint a flight of impossibly coloured Australian macaws alighting on St. Paul's Cathedral. If I painted you against a nice traditional bit of outdoor landscape, I believe I'd get exactly the same result." I said, "Then will you paint me?" He said, "You're one of the loveliest, crudest, most flamboyant bits of exotic colouring I've ever seen. I'll paint you." I said, "Then that's settled." He went on, "But I warn you, Elsa Greer, if I do paint you, I shall probably make love to you." I said, "I hope you will." I said it quite steadily and quietly. I heard him catch his breath, and I saw the look that came into his eyes. You see, it was as sudden as all that. A day or two later we met again. He told me that he wanted me to come down to Devonshire. He'd got the very place there he wanted for a background. He said, "I'm married, you know, and I'm very fond of my wife." I said if he was fond of her, she must be very nice. He said she was extremely nice. In fact, he said, she's quite adorable, and I adore her. So put that in your pipe, young Elsa, and smoke it. I told him that I quite understood. He began the picture a week later. Caroline Creel welcomed me very pleasantly. She didn't like me much, but after all, why should she? Amias was very circumspect. He never said a word to me that his wife couldn't have overheard. And I was quite polite and formal to him. Underneath, though, we both knew. After 10 days, he told me I was to go back to London. I said, "The picture isn't finished." He said, "It's barely begun. The truth is, I can't paint you, Elsa." I said, "Why?" He said, "You know well enough why, Elsa, and that's why you've got to clear out. I can't think about the painting. I can't think about anything but you." We were in the Battery Garden. It was a hot, sunny day. There were birds and hummingbees. It ought to have been very happy and peaceful, but it didn't feel like that. It felt somehow tragic, as though what was going to happen was already mirrored there. I knew it would be no good my going back to London, but I said, "Very well, I'll go if you say so." Amias said, "Good girl." So I went. I didn't write to him. He held out for 10 days, and then he came. He was so thin and haggard and miserable that it shocked me. He said, "I warned you, Elsa. Don't say I didn't warn you." I said, "I've been waiting for you. I knew you'd come." He gave a sort of groan and said, "There are things that are too strong for any man. I can't eat or sleep or rest for wanting you." I said I knew that it was the same with me, and had been from the first moment I'd seen him. It was fate, and it was no use struggling against it. He said, "You haven't struggled much, have you, Elsa?" And I said I hadn't struggled at all. He said he wished I wasn't so young, and I said that didn't matter. I suppose I might say that for the next few weeks we were very happy, but happiness isn't quite the word. It was something deeper and more frightening than that. We were made for each other, and we'd found each other, and we both knew we'd got to be together, always. But something else happened too. The unfinished picture began to haunt Amias. He said to me, "Damn funny. I couldn't paint you before. You yourself got in the way of it. But I want to paint you, Elsa. I want to paint you so that the picture will be the finest thing I've ever done. I'm itching and aching now to get at my brushes, to see you sitting there on that hoary old chestnut of a battlement wall, with the conventional blue sea and the decorous English trees, and you, sitting there like a discordant shriek of triumph." He said, "And I've got to paint you that way, and I can't be fussed and bothered while I'm doing it. When the picture's finished, I'll tell Caroline the truth, and we'll get the whole messy business cleared up." I said, "Will Caroline make a fuss about divorcing you?" He said he didn't think so, but you never knew with women. I said I was sorry if she was going to be upset, but after all, I said, these things did happen. He said, "Very nice and reasonable, Elsa. But Caroline isn't reasonable, never has been reasonable, and certainly isn't going to feel reasonable. She loves me, you know." I said I understood that, but if she loved him, she'd put his happiness first, and at any rate, she wouldn't want to keep him if he wanted to be free. He said, "Life can't really be solved by admirable maxims out of modern literature. Nature's red in tooth and claw, remember." I said, "Surely we're all civilized people nowadays," and Amias laughed. He said, "Civilized people, my foot. Caroline would probably like to take a hatchet to you. She might do it too. Don't you realize, Elsa, that she's going to suffer? Suffer. Don't you know what suffering means?" I said, "Then don't tell her." He said, "No, the break's got to come. You've got to belong to me properly, Elsa, before all the world, openly mine." I said, "Suppose she won't divorce you?" He said, "I'm not afraid of that." I said, "What are you afraid of then?" And then he said slowly, "I don't know. You see, he knew Caroline. I didn't. If I'd had any idea... We went down again to Alderbury. Things were difficult this time. Caroline had got suspicious. I didn't like it. I didn't like it a bit. I've always hated deceit and concealment. I thought we ought to tell her. Amias wouldn't hear of it. The funny part of it was that he didn't really care at all. In spite of being fond of Caroline and not wanting to hurt her, he just didn't care about the honesty or dishonesty of it all. He was painting with a kind of frenzy, and nothing else mattered. I hadn't seen him in one of his working spells before. I realized now what a really great genius he was. It was natural for him to be so carried away that all the ordinary decencies didn't matter. But it was different for me. I was in a horrible position. Caroline resented me, and quite rightly. The only thing to put the position quite straight was to be honest and tell her the truth. But all Amias would say was that he wasn't going to be bothered with scenes and fusses until he'd finished the picture. I said there probably wouldn't be a scene. Caroline would have too much dignity and pride for that. I said, I want to be honest about it all. We've got to be honest. Amias said, to hell with honesty. I'm painting a picture, damn it. I did see his point of view, but he wouldn't see mine, and in the end I broke down. Caroline had been talking of some plan she and Amias were going to carry out next autumn. She talked about it quite confidently, and I suddenly felt it was too abominable what we were doing, letting her go on like this, and perhaps, too, I was angry, because she was really being very unpleasant to me in a clever sort of way that one couldn't take hold of. And so I came out with the truth. In a way, I still think I was right, though of course I wouldn't have done it if I'd had the faintest idea what was to come of it. The clash came right away. Amias was furious with me, but he had to admit that what I had said was true. I didn't understand Caroline at all. We all went over to Meredith Blake's to tea, and Caroline played up marvellously, talking and laughing. Like a fool, I thought she was taking it well. It was awkward, my not being able to leave the house, but Amias would have gone up in smoke if I had. I thought perhaps Caroline would go. It would have made it much easier for us if she had. I didn't see her take the quinine. I want to be honest, so I think that it's just possible that she may have taken it, as she said she did, with the idea of suicide in her mind. But I don't really think so. I think she was one of those intensely jealous and possessive women who won't let go of anything that they think belongs to them. Amias was her property. I think she was quite prepared to kill him rather than let him go, completely and finally to another woman. I think she made up her mind right away to kill him. And I think that Meredith's happening to discuss quinine so freely just gave her the means to do what she'd already made up her mind to do. She was a very bitter and revengeful woman, vindictive. Amias knew all along that she was dangerous. I didn't. The next morning she had a final showdown with Amias. I heard most of it from the outside on the terrace. He was splendid, very patient and calm. He implored her to be reasonable. He said he was very fond of her and the child, and always would be. He'd do everything he could to assure their future. Then he hardened up and said, "But understand this. I'm damn well going to marry Elsa, and nothing shall stop me. You and I always agreed to leave each other free. These things happen." Caroline said to him, "Do as you please. I've warned you." Her voice was very quiet, but there was a queer note in it. Amias said, "What do you mean, Caroline?" She said, "You're mine, and I don't mean to let you go. Sooner than let you go to that girl, I'll kill you." Just at that minute, Philip Blake came along the terrace. I got up and went to meet him. I didn't want him to overhear. Presently, Amias came out and said it was time to get on with the picture. We went down together to the Battery. He didn't say much, just said that Caroline was cutting up rough, but for God's sake, not to talk about it. He wanted to concentrate on what he was doing. Another day, he said, would about finish the picture. He said, "And it'll be the best thing I've ever done, Elsa, even if it's paid for in blood and tears." A little later, I went up to the house to get a pullover. There was a chilly wind blowing. When I came back again, Caroline was there. I suppose she had come down to make one last appeal. Philip and Meredith Blake were there too. It was then that Amias said he was thirsty and wanted a drink. He said there was beer, but it wasn't iced. Caroline said she'd sent him down some iced beer. She said it quite naturally, in an almost friendly tone. She was an actress, that woman. She must have known then what she meant to do. She brought it down about 10 minutes later. Amias was painting. She poured it out and set the glass down beside him. Neither of us were watching her. Amias was intent on what he was doing, and I had to keep the pose. Amias drank it down the way he always drank beer, just pouring it down his throat in one draught. Then he made a face and said it tasted foul, but at any rate it was cold. And even then, when he said that, no suspicion entered my head. I just laughed and said, "Liver." When she'd seen him drink it, Caroline went away. It must have been about 40 minutes later that Amias complained of stiffness and pains. He said he thought he must have got a touch of muscular rheumatism. Amias was always intolerant of any ailment, and he didn't like being fussed over. After saying that, he turned it off with a light, "Old age, I suppose. You've taken on a creaking old man, Elsa." I played up to him, but I noticed that his legs moved stiffly and queerly, and that he grimaced once or twice. I never dreamt that it wasn't rheumatism. Presently, he drew the bench along and sat sprawled on that, occasionally stretching up to put a touch of paint here and there on the canvas. He used to do that sometimes when he was painting, just sit staring at me, then at the canvas. Sometimes he'd do it for half an hour at a time, so I didn't think it specially queer. We heard the bell go for lunch, and he said he wasn't coming up. He'd stay where he was, and he didn't want anything. That wasn't unusual either, and it would be easier for him than facing Caroline at the table. He was talking in a rather queer way, grunting out his words, but he sometimes did that when he was dissatisfied with the progress of the picture. Meredith Blake came in to fetch me. He spoke to Amias, but Amias only grunted at him. We went up to the house together and left him there. We left him there, to die alone. I'd never seen much illness. I didn't know much about it. I thought Amias was just in a painter's mood. If I'd known, if I'd realized, perhaps a doctor could have saved him. Oh, God, why didn't I? It's no good thinking of that now. I was a blind fool. A blind, stupid fool. There isn't much more to tell. Caroline and the governess went down there after lunch. Meredith followed them. Presently he came running up. He told us Amias was dead. Then I knew. Knew, I mean, that it was Caroline. I still didn't think of poison. I thought she'd gone down that minute and either shot him or stabbed him. I wanted to get at her, to kill her. How could she do it? How could she? He was so alive, so full of life and vigor. To put all that out, to make him limp and cold, just so that I shouldn't have him. Horrible woman. Horrible, scornful, cruel, vindictive woman. I hate her. I still hate her. They didn't even hang her. They ought to have hanged her. Even hanging was too good for her. I hate her. I hate her. I hate her. End of Lady Dittersham's narrative. Narrative of Cecilia Williams. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I am sending you an account of those events at Alderbury in September, actually witnessed by myself. I have been absolutely frank and have kept nothing back. You may show it to Carla Crail. It may pain her, but I have always been a believer in truth. Palliatives are harmful. One must have the courage to face reality. Without that courage, life is meaningless. The people who do us most harm are the people who shield us from reality. Believe me, yours sincerely, Cecilia Williams. My name is Cecilia Williams. I was engaged by Mrs. Crail as governess to her half-sister, Angela Warren. I took up my duties at Alderbury, a very beautiful estate in South Devon, which had belonged to Mr. Crail's family for many generations. I knew that Mr. Crail was a well-known painter, but I did not meet him until I took up residence at Alderbury. The household consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Crail, Angela Warren, then a girl of 13, and 3 servants, all of whom had been with the family many years. I found my pupil an interesting and promising character, She had very marked abilities, and it was a pleasure to teach her. She was somewhat wild and undisciplined, but these faults arose mainly through high spirits, and I have always preferred my girls to show spirit. An excess of vitality can be trained and guided into paths of real usefulness and achievement. On the whole, I found Angela amenable to discipline. She had been somewhat spoiled, mainly by Mrs. Crail, who was far too indulgent where she was concerned. Mr. Crail's influence was, I considered, unwise. He indulged her absurdly one day, and was unnecessarily peremptory on another occasion. He was very much a man of moods, possibly owing to what is styled the artistic temperament. I have never seen myself why the possession of artistic ability should be supposed to excuse a man from a decent exercise of self-control. I did not myself admire Mr. Crail's paintings. The drawings seemed to me faulty, and the colouring exaggerated, but naturally I was not called upon to express any opinion on these matters. I soon formed a deep attachment to Mrs. Crail. I admired her character and her fortitude in the difficulties of her life. Mr. Crail was not a faithful husband, and I think that that fact was the source of much pain to her. A stronger-minded woman would have left him, but Mrs. Crail never seemed to contemplate such a course. She endured his infidelities and forgave him for them, but I may say that she did not take them meekly. She remonstrated, and with spirit. It was said at the trial that they led a cat-and-dog life. I would not go as far as that. Mrs. Crail had too much dignity for that term to apply, but they did have quarrels, and I consider that that was only natural under the circumstances. I had been with Mrs. Crail just over 2 years when Miss Elsa Greer appeared upon the scene. She arrived down at Alderbury early in the summer. Mrs. Crail had not met her previously. She was Mr. Crail's friend, and she was said to be there for the purpose of having her portrait painted. It was apparent at once that Mr. Crail was infatuated with this girl, and that the girl herself was doing nothing to discourage him. She behaved, in my opinion, quite outrageously, being abominably rude to Mrs. Crail and openly flirting with Mr. Crail. Naturally, Mrs. Crail said nothing to me, but I could see that she was disturbed and unhappy, and I did everything in my power to distract her mind and lighten her burden. Miss Greer sat every day for Mr. Crail, but I noticed that the picture was not getting on very fast. They had no doubt other things to talk about. My pupil, I am thankful to say, noticed very little of what was going on. Angela was in some ways young for her age. Though her intellect was well developed, she was not at all what I may term precocious. She seemed to have no wish to read undesirable books, and showed no signs of morbid curiosity, such as girls often do at her age. She therefore saw nothing undesirable in the friendship between Mr. Crail and Miss Greer. Nevertheless, she disliked Miss Greer, and thought her stupid. Here she was quite right. Miss Greer had had, I presume, a proper education, but she never opened a book, and was quite unfamiliar with current literary allusions. Moreover, she could not sustain a discussion on any intellectual subject. She was entirely taken up with her personal appearance, her clothes, and men. Angela, I think, did not even realize that her sister was unhappy. She was not at that time a very perceptive person. She spent a lot of time in hoydenish pastimes, such as tree climbing and wild feats of bicycling. She was also a passionate reader, and showed excellent taste in what she liked and disliked. Mrs. Crail was always careful to conceal any signs of unhappiness from Angela, and exerted herself to appear bright and cheerful when the girl was about. Miss Greer went back to London, at which I can tell you we were all very pleased. The servants disliked her as much as I did. She was the kind of person who gives a lot of unnecessary trouble and forgets to say thank you. Mr. Crail went away shortly afterwards, and of course I knew that he had gone after the girl. I was very sorry for Mrs. Crail. She felt these things very keenly. I felt extremely bitter towards Mr. Crail. When a man has a charming, gracious, intelligent wife, he's no business to treat her badly. However, she and I both hoped the affair would soon be over. Not that we mentioned the subject to each other. We did not. But she knew quite well how I felt about it. Unfortunately, after some weeks, the pair of them reappeared. It seemed the sittings were to be resumed. Mr. Crail was now painting with absolute frenzy. He seemed less preoccupied with the girl, than with his picture of her. Nevertheless, I realized that this was not the usual kind of thing we had gone through before. This girl had got her claws into him, and she meant business. He was just like wax in her hands. The thing came to a head on the day before he died. That is, on September the 17th. Miss Greer's manners had been unbearably insolent the last few days. She was feeling sure of herself, and she wanted to assert her importance. Mrs. Crail behaved like a true gentlewoman. She was icily polite, but she showed the other clearly what she thought of her. On this day, September the 17th, as we were sitting in the drawing-room after lunch, Miss Greer came out with an amazing remark as to how she was going to redecorate the room when she was living at Alderbury. Naturally, Mrs. Crail couldn't let that pass. She challenged her, and Miss Greer had the impudence to say before us all that she was going to marry Mr. Crail. She actually talked about marrying a married man, and she said it to his wife. I was very, very angry with Mr. Crail. How dared he let this girl insult his wife in her own drawing-room? If he wanted to run away with the girl, he should have gone off with her, not brought her into his wife's house and backed her up in her insolence. In spite of what she must have felt, Mrs. Crail did not lose her dignity. Her husband came in just then, and she immediately demanded confirmation from him. He was, not unnaturally, annoyed with Miss Greer for her unconsidered forcing of the situation. Apart from anything else, it made him appear at a disadvantage, and men do not like appearing at a disadvantage. It upsets their vanity. He stood there, a great giant of a man, looking as sheepish and foolish as a naughty schoolboy. It was his wife who carried off the honours of the situation. He had to mutter foolishly that it was true, but that he hadn't meant her to learn it like this. I have never seen anything like the look of scorn she gave him. She went out of the room with her head held high. She was a beautiful woman, much more beautiful than that flamboyant girl, and she walked like an empress. I hoped with all my heart that Amias Crail would be punished for the cruelty he had displayed, and for the indignity he had put upon a long-suffering and noble woman. For the first time, I tried to say something of what I felt to Mrs. Crail, but she stopped me. She said, "We must try and behave as usual. It's the best way. We're all going over to Meredith Blake's to tea." I said to her then, "I think you are wonderful, Mrs. Crail." She said, "You don't know." Then, as she was going out of the room, she came back and kissed me. She said, "You are such a comfort to me." She went to her room then, and I think she cried. I saw her when they all started off. She was wearing a big-brimmed hat that shaded her face, a hat she very seldom wore. Mr. Crail was uneasy, but was trying to brazen things out. Mr. Philip Blake was trying to behave as usual. That Miss Greer was looking like a cat who has got at the cream jug, all self-satisfaction and purrs. They all started off. They got back about 6. I did not see Mrs. Crail again alone that evening. She was very quiet and composed at dinner, and she went to bed early. I don't think that anyone knew how she was suffering. The evening was taken up with a kind of running quarrel between Mr. Crail and Angela. They brought up the old school question again. He was irritable and on edge, and she was unusually trying. The whole matter was settled, and her outfit had been bought, and there was no sense in starting up an argument again, but she suddenly chose to make a grievance of it. I have no doubt she sensed the tension in the air, and that it reacted on her as much as on everybody else. I'm afraid I was too preoccupied with my own thoughts to try to check her, as I should have done. It all ended with her flinging a paperweight at Mr. Crail and dashing out of the room. I went after her, and told her sharply that I was ashamed at her behaving like a baby. But she was still very uncontrolled, and I thought it best to leave her alone. I hesitated as to whether to go to Mrs. Crail's room, but I decided in the end that it would perhaps annoy her. I wish, since, that I had overcome my diffidence, and insisted on her talking to me. If she had done so, it might possibly have made a difference. She had no one, you see, in whom she could confide. Although I admire self-control, I must regretfully admit that sometimes it can be carried too far. A natural outlet to the feelings is better. I met Mr. Crail as I went along to my room. He said, "Good night," but I did not answer. The next morning was, I remember, a beautiful day. One felt when waking that surely, with such peace all around, even a man must come to his senses. I went into Angela's room before going down to breakfast, but she was already up and out. I picked up a torn skirt which she had left lying on the floor and took it down with me for her to mend after breakfast. She had, however, obtained bread and marmalade from the kitchen and gone out. After I had had my own breakfast, I went in search of her. I mention this to explain why I was not more with Mrs. Crail on that morning, as perhaps I should have been. At the time, however, I felt it was my duty to look for Angela. She was very naughty and obstinate about mending her clothes, and I had no intention of allowing her to defy me in the matter. Her bathing dress was missing, and I accordingly went down to the beach. There was no sign of her in the water or on the rocks, so I conceived it possible that she had gone over to Mr. Meredith Blake's. She and he were great friends. I accordingly rowed myself across and resumed my search. I did not find her, and eventually returned. Mrs. Crail, Mr. Blake, and Mr. Philip Blake were on the terrace. It was very hot that morning if one was out of the wind, and the house and terrace were sheltered. Mrs. Crail suggested they might like some iced beer. There was a little conservatory which had been built onto the house in Victorian days. Mrs. Crail disliked it, and it was not used for plants, but it had been made into a kind of bar with various bottles of gin and vermouth, lemonade, ginger beer, etc., on shelves, and a small refrigerator which was filled with ice every morning, and in which some beer and ginger beer was always kept. Mrs. Crail went there to get the beer, and I went with her. Angela was at the refrigerator and was just taking out a bottle of beer. Mrs. Crail went in ahead of me. She said, "I want a bottle of beer to take down to Amias." It is so difficult now to know whether I ought to have suspected anything. Her voice, I feel almost convinced, was perfectly normal, but I must admit that at that moment I was intent not on her, but on Angela. Angela was by the refrigerator, and I was glad to see that she looked red and rather guilty. I was rather sharp with her, and to my surprise she was quite meek. I asked her where she had been, and she said she had been bathing. I said, "I didn't see you on the beach," and she laughed. Then I asked her where her jersey was, and she said she must have left it down on the beach. I mention these details to explain why I let Mrs. Crail take the beer down to the Battery Garden. The rest of the morning is quite blank in my mind. Angela fetched her needlebook and mended her skirt without any more fuss. I rather think that I mended some of the household linen. Mr. Crail did not come up for lunch. I was glad that he had at least that much decency. After lunch, Mrs. Crail said she was going down to the Battery. I wanted to retrieve Angela's jersey from the beach. We started down together. She went into the Battery. I was going on when her cry called me back. As I told you when you came to see me, she asked me to go up and telephone. On the way up, I met Mr. Meredith Blake, and then went back to Mrs. Crail. That was my story as I told it at the inquest, and later at the trial. What I am about to write down, I have never told to any living soul. I was not asked any questions to which I returned an untrue answer. Nevertheless, I was guilty of withholding certain facts. I do not repent of that. I would do it again. I am fully aware that in revealing this, I may be laying myself open to censure, but I do not think that after this lapse of time, anyone will take the matter very seriously, especially since Caroline Crail was convicted without my evidence. This, then, is what happened. I met Mr. Meredith Blake, as I said, and I ran down the path again as quickly as I could. I was wearing sand shoes, and have always been light on my feet. I came to the open Battery door, and this is what I saw. Mrs. Crail was busily polishing the beer bottle on the table with her handkerchief. Having done so, she took her dead husband's hand and pressed the fingers of it on the beer bottle. All the time she was listening and on the alert. It was the fear I saw on her face that told me the truth. I knew then, beyond any possible doubt, that Caroline Crail had poisoned her husband. And I, for one, do not blame her. He drove her to a point beyond human endurance, and he brought his fate upon himself. I never mentioned the incident to Mrs. Crail, and she never knew that I had seen it. Caroline Crail's daughter must not bolster up her life with a lie. However much it may pain her to know the truth, truth is the only thing that matters. Tell her from me that her mother is not to be judged. She was driven beyond what a loving woman can endure. It is for her daughter to understand and forgive. End of Cecilia Williams' narrative. Narrative of Angela Warren. Dear Mr. Poirot, I am keeping my promise to you and have written down all I can remember of that terrible time 16 years ago. But it was not until I started that I realized how very little I did remember. Until the thing actually happened, you see, there is nothing to fix anything by. I've just a vague memory of summer days and isolated incidents, but I couldn't say for certain what summer they happened even. Amias's death was just a thunderclap coming out of the blue. I had no warning of it, and I seem to have missed everything that led up to it. I've been trying to think whether that was to be expected or not. Are most girls of 15 as blind and deaf and obtuse as I seem to have been? Perhaps they are. I was quick, I think, to gauge people's moods, but I never bothered my head about what caused those moods. Besides, just at that time, I'd suddenly begun to discover the intoxication of words. Things that I'd read, scraps of poetry, of Shakespeare, would echo in my head. I remember now, walking along the kitchen garden path, repeating to myself in a kind of ecstatic delirium, "Under the glassy green translucent wave." It was just so lovely. I had to say it over and over again. And mixed up with these new discoveries and excitements, there were all the things I'd liked doing ever since I could remember. Swimming and climbing trees and eating fruit and playing tricks on the stable boy and feeding the horses. Caroline and Amias I took for granted. They were the central figures in my world, but I never thought about them, or about their affairs, or what they thought and felt. I didn't notice Elsa Greer's coming particularly. I thought she was stupid, and I didn't even think she was good-looking. I accepted her as someone rich but tiresome, whom Amias was painting. Actually, the very first intimation I had of the whole thing was what I overheard from the terrace where I had escaped after lunch one day. Elsa said she was going to marry Amias. It struck me as just ridiculous. I remember tackling Amias about it. In the garden at Handcross it was. I said to him, "Why does Elsa say she's going to marry you? She couldn't. People can't have two wives. It's bigamy, and they go to prison." Amias got very angry and said, "How the devil did you hear that?" I said I'd heard it through the library window. He was angrier than ever then, and said it was high time I went to school and got out of the habit of eavesdropping. I still remember the resentment I felt when he said that, because it was so unfair. Absolutely and utterly unfair. I stammered out angrily that I hadn't been listening. And anyhow, I said, "Why did Elsa say a silly thing like that?" Amias said it was just a joke. That ought to have satisfied me. It did, almost, but not quite. I said to Elsa when we were on the way back, "I asked Amias what you meant when you said you were going to marry him, and he said it was just a joke." I felt that ought to snub her, but she only smiled. I didn't like that smile of hers. I went up to Caroline's room. It was when she was dressing for dinner. I asked her then outright if it were possible for Amias to marry Elsa. I remember Caroline's answer as though I heard it now. She must have spoken with great emphasis. "Amias will only marry Elsa after I am dead," she said. That reassured me completely. Death seemed ages away from us all. Nevertheless, I was still very sore with Amias about what he had said in the afternoon, and I went for him violently all through dinner. And I remember we had a real flaming row, and I rushed out of the room and went up to bed and howled myself to sleep. I don't remember much about the afternoon at Meredith Blake's, although I do remember his reading aloud the passage from Phaedo describing Socrates' death. I had never heard it before. I thought it was the loveliest, the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I remember that, but I don't remember when it was. As far as I can recall now, it might have been any time that summer. I don't remember anything that happened the next morning either, though I have thought and thought. I've a vague feeling that I must have bathed, and I think I remember being made to mend something. But it's all very vague and dim, till the time when Meredith came panting up the path from the terrace, and his face was all grey and queer. I remember a coffee cup falling off the table and being broken. Elsa did that, and I remember her running, suddenly running, for all she was worth down the path, and the awful look there was on her face. I kept saying to myself, Amias is dead, but it just didn't seem real. I remember Dr. Fawcett coming and his grave face. Miss Williams was busy looking after Caroline. I wandered about rather forlornly, getting in people's way. I had a nasty, sick feeling. They wouldn't let me go down and see Amias. But by and by the police came and wrote down things in notebooks, and presently they brought his body up on a stretcher, covered with a cloth. Miss Williams took me into Caroline's room later. Caroline was on the sofa. She looked very white and ill. She kissed me and said she wanted me to go away as soon as I could, and it was all horrible. But I wasn't to worry or think about it any more than I could help. I was to join Carla at Lady Tressilian's, because this house was to be kept as empty as possible. I clung to Caroline and said I didn't want to go away. I wanted to stay with her. She said she knew I did, but it was better for me to go away, and would take a lot of worry off her mind. And Miss Williams chipped in and said, "The best way you can help your sister, Angela, is to do what she wants you to do without making a fuss about it." So I said I would do whatever Caroline wished, and Caroline said, "That's my darling Angela." And she hugged me and said there was nothing to worry about, and to talk about it and think about it all as little as possible. I had to go down and talk to a police superintendent. He was very kind, asked me when I had last seen Amias, and a lot of other questions which seemed to me quite pointless at the time, but which of course I see the point of now. He satisfied himself that there was nothing that I could tell him which he hadn't already heard from the others. So he told Miss Williams that he saw no objection to my going over to Ferriby Grange, to Lady Tressilian's. I went there, and Lady Tressilian was very kind to me, but of course I soon had to know the truth. They arrested Caroline almost at once. I was so horrified and dumbfounded that I became quite ill. I heard afterwards that Caroline was terribly worried about me. It was at her insistence that I was sent out of England before the trial came on, but that I have told you already. As you see, what I have to put down is pitiably meagre. Since talking to you, I have gone over the little I remember painstakingly, racking my memory for details of this or that person's expression or reaction. I can remember nothing consistent with guilt. Elsa's frenzy, Meredith's grey, worried face, Philip's grief and fury, they all seem natural enough. I suppose, though, someone could have been playing a part. I only know this. Caroline did not do it. I'm quite certain on this point, and always shall be. But I have no evidence to offer except my own intimate knowledge of her character. End of Angela Warren's narrative.
End of Disc 5.